Hi, Lorraine. This is the part two of the Gilded Age. So we left off with Grover Cleveland being elected president with the help of the mugwumps who were not happy with the Republican Party, and their party was divided. So Grover Cleveland won the election in 1884, and he was a Democrat. Moving on from that, so make sure that you did see the video on the first part of the Gilded Age and the end of Reconstruction so that we keep all of these in order. It'll be very confusing for you. We don't want that. So something else you need to know at that time period, railroad strike of 1877. And that was the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the labor question. So that had more to do now with how labor in the country, the United States, and how labor was being treated. And I mean, we did talk a little bit about the different unions that were forming to make labor a little bit better represented, some of the labor forces. So the focus is now off of the Reconstruction of the South, which is unfortunate because the South and the black people in the South suffered for another 100 years because the attention was off all of the pretty much the rules and laws that were supposed to help them after Reconstruction got lost. So that didn't work out very well. So they moved on to the labor question. The railroad strike was called the Great Upheaval because they're cut to the wages after the Panic of 1873. Every so many years, our country goes through a financial panic. Now it's Wall Street. Then it was the banks. Sometimes it's the banks and Wall Street. So at that point, it was the Panic of 1873, and there were a lot of strikes in sympathy to the workers, and that spread throughout West Virginia to Illinois. They were unhappy about their wages being cut because the people who owned the railroads and were cutting wages because of the panic, and there wasn't as much money. President Hayes broke up the strike with federal troops because he said it was interrupting interstate commerce. It's not normal for the government to get involved in companies striking and their workers and everything that's going on between workers in a company. But if it disrupts interstate commerce, if it is really affecting the country in a bigger way than just between the workers and the companies, government will sometimes step in. It also happened in the air controller strike many years later, but President Reagan did that also. So sometimes the president or the government does step in. In this case, he broke up the strike with federal troops because he said it was interrupting interstate commerce and the violence was getting out of hand. So it was time to step in. Make a note to yourself that in the Gilded Age, presidents tend to decide with big business and not with the consumer or the worker. Some of the different events and strikes, union disputes that you do need to know about, I believe, are the Haymarket affair, Haymarket, Hay Market, 1886, and that's in Chicago. A bomb went off in Haymarket Square during a rally near the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company. Police fired weapons, both cops and civilians were killed. And this was a landmark case, which is why you might see it on a test, the Haymarket Affair, 1886. What did it have to do with labor or any kind of a labor and business? And that's what this section is pretty much about. That unions were blamed and ultimately associated with socialism and anarchy, anti-establishment. So there was this idea that if you were involved in that you were a socialist, you were completely anti-democracy, you were against the government, you were against establishment, you weren't going to follow any rules. And it was also an attempt to set those people, put them into a category of being against the government so that they could then kind of take action against them. So the fact is that that isn't always the way unions work, but if you can separate and make them out to be bad people, then it's easier to fight against them and not be fair. So unions were blamed and associated, and unions became associated with socialism and anarchy, anti-establishment. That happened at the Haymarket Affair, 1886. Since many union members were immigrants, that just increased the whole idea of nativism, which was animosity towards foreigners. We've talked about that term. You do need to know it. Nativism is when you are thinking your native country is more important and better than everybody else. And especially in terms of immigrants coming in, people felt that they were trying to take something away from them. So nativism is an important term to know. So an animosity towards foreigners. And since many union members were immigrants because they had come here looking for jobs, they ended up working in factories and places like that, and then they joined a union to try to get some fair treatment. They were very often members of the union. So that increases the tension between, because you not only have the labor, you also have the fact that a lot of them are immigrants. There was also a sharp decrease in unionization. People stopped joining unions for a while because they were, made to fear being in a union and being told that they were bad and you shouldn't be in a union and all of these things. So it was a difficult time. We still have unions now, but there's always been an issue between unions and labor. All right, our owners. So another definition you need to know is the Homestead Strike of 1892. And that was another defeat for the unions. You can kind of see when you're looking at unions who are the workers trying to fight against the companies, how it's going. This was another defeat for the unions. It was the Homestead Act strike of 1892, and it was at Andrew Carnegie's steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania. They began to unionize, which means that people join the union, and they're then not on their own. They're part of a group in order to negotiate and threaten strike. So a lot of large companies, of course, don't want their members to do that because they want to be able to fire them. They don't want them to be able to collectively come in and make demands or threaten to go on strike. So companies obviously don't like the unions. Andrew Carnegie's steel plant, the people there began to unionize, which means they would join the union and vow to work together. The company fought it. They threatened to hire scabs, which are non-union replacement workers. So if you ever hear the term scab in relationship to a union or anything to do with workers, it's not a SOAR. It's referring to people who will come in who are non-union, who will take the worker's place and work for less money. The idea is that if you say you're going to go on strike and you leave, the idea is your company is supposed to suffer until they say, no, come back, we need you. Well, if scabs, other people come in who are not in the union and they're willing to work, then you lose your leverage or your power as the union member. So somebody has taken your job, they're getting paid, you're not, and the company no longer cares if you're there or not. So you lose that. So scabs were looked down on by other workers, but they were people who would come in and take the jobs, and that would then reduce the power of the workers because they didn't have anything to fight with. Violence did erupt between the strikers and the Pinkerton private agency, which are private detectives. So when you hear Pinkertons, there usually was a big private detective agency back then, and that's who they're referring to. So they were in there investigating. So there was a violence erupted between the strikers and the private detectives who were there for the owners, and strikers were later arrested and tried for treason. Got pretty ugly. Another strike that you need to be aware of, the name especially, is the Pullman strike of 1894, and that's Pullman. I know I'm going a little quickly, but you can pause me, so I figure I can give you all the information and you can just stop me whenever you want. Pullman strike of 1894. The Pullman cars were luxury railroad cars. The railroad by then was very popular, made people very, very wealthy, the people that owned it. And they had luxury cars for the wealthy to travel in. The wages went down at the factory, and so the workers who worked on those cars went on strike. So Eugene Debs, a socialist, instructed the railroad workers to halt trains with Pullman cars on them. So whenever they saw a Pullman car, which meant it was a luxury car, it told them to stop it and halt those trains. So of course that made people angry. It also made them fearful because they felt they were being targeted because they were the ones that had the luxury cars. And they were also, it was because the workers who were working on that type of car wanted to make the point that we can stop this. Okay, so they halted trains with pulling cars on them to let everyone know that they were on strike and that they wanted to make a point that they were not happy with the reduced wages that they were getting. So there was a lot of violence and property damage accompanied by the strike. Now, back when unions were first formed, there was more violence than there is now. We have unions a lot of places, but they're not violent. They usually end up in the courts or something if there's a problem. But back then, when unions were just starting and people did not have a lot of power, the government was pretty much siding with business. There was much more violence when it came to unions and owners and the struggles that they had. So there was a lot of violence and property damage in that strike, and President Grover Cleveland said the strike actions disrupted the federal mail. So again, if he can prove that it involves more than just a worker and a company, then you can step in and do something about it, which here you have a president stepping in again and saying the railroad's problems are also causing disruptions with the federal mail, which he does have an interest in. It is one of his jobs to protect. Because it's federal. So he got a court injunction, which is just a court order to end the strike, and Debs went to prison over it. So the person who started the strike went to prison. The government got involved to end the strike legally through the courts, but still it's unusual for them to get involved. But it was because it also involved the government in terms of federal mail. Another example, though, of the president siding with employers or bosses or owners and not with the everyday people and the workers. Definition: Panic of 1893 and Coxey's Army of 1894. Okay, so they were now moving off of that. We're moving into the financial panic, which as I said, we have here every so often. This one is a Panic of 1893. And Coxey's Army is Coxeys Army of 1894. Okay, so every few decades of the 19th century and also of the 20th century, probably the 21st century, there are financial panics having to do with our money system. So in the 19th century, it was 1837, 1857, 1873, and 1893, and those were the financial panics. The one in 1893 led to immense unemployment. So you already have all these labor problems, and now you just have unemployment. People can't get jobs. At that time, an Ohio politician, Jacob Coxey, which is the name I gave you, he gathered an army of unemployed men who demanded that the government provide jobs in public works, which when you say public works here, it means government construction. So if you're in the public works department, you're doing roads and bridges and anything to do with construction that's for the whole nation, not just a state usually. So Jacob Coxey got an army of unemployed men who demanded that the government provide this type of job because they were all out of work, starving, didn't have any kind of a safety net at that time. We do now if you're out of work. There was no money coming in. So Coxey's and his little army marched through the country and into Washington, D.C. There, members of his army were arrested for trespassing on the U.S. Capitol lawn. So the idea is it was showing that people were getting desperate, that when there's an economic crisis, obviously the people who have the least, the ones on the bottom, tend to struggle the most. So they had zero jobs, and they were demanding that the government now step in. So sometimes people want the government in their lives, and sometimes they don't. At this point, they did. All right, another term you need to know, Interstate Commerce Act and Interstate Commerce Commission, 1887. And I know we are just kind of hitting the high points on this, but since you don't have time for a full history lesson on everything, we're going to go with what I'm pretty sure you need to know. Interstate Commerce Act and Interstate Commerce Commission, 1887. And this is all going along with how we are progressing in the country in terms of workers and unions and what the people want out of the government and what the government gets into to do. So this act created the Interstate Commerce Committee, It looked into the railroad shipping fees to make sure they were reasonable and just. Because when we talked about earlier how the railroads, people in power could just charge whatever they wanted, and people, government would pay it. Some people getting rich and some people had nothing. So this was a time they were trying to step in and create some rules, some acts that would make things a little more fair. So the idea was that the shipping fees needed to be reasonable and just. They also wanted to make sure that the rates were published, so you couldn't have discrimination about prices. You actually could look at it and say, oh, that's what you're going to charge, as opposed to showing up and getting a high bill. Of course, in the Gilded Age, nothing really worked the way it was supposed to. So even though they call it the ICC for short, Interstate Commerce Commission, it wasn't very strong. They had good ideas and they passed these laws and they did these rules, but it didn't really help the consumers very much because not everybody followed the rules, as usually happens. So the idea was there, and at least we're moving towards our country trying to look at helping people who don't have as much, and the fact that that big business is taking advantage of them. All right, so it wasn't much help for them then. Before the ICC, farmers pressured Illinois to create legislation to prevent inflated prices for hauling and storing crops. So the farmers were saying, you know, the prices are just too high for us to haul and store crops. We can't make any money. So there was a Supreme Court ruling, and you need to know this, and I'm hoping it might be on that list I just sent you of a lot of the cases that you need to know. 1877, Munn versus Illinois, M-U-N-N-B, Illinois. And the Supreme Court upheld the Granger laws that were passed by the states, which were looking to protect the farmers. Okay, so that you do need to know, Munn versus Illinois was to protect farmers from the inflated prices that they were getting for hauling and storing crops. The impact of this decision was then reduced in 1886 by another case, Wabash, W-A-B-A-S-H, Wabash case, which is Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railroad Company versus Illinois. Just remember the Wabash part of it. It's Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railroad Company v. Illinois. So you've got three parties versus Illinois. The court said that the states could not regulate interstate commerce. Okay, so now they just said now states can't regulate interstate commerce. So states cannot regulate the commerce. So an ICC was needed, an Interstate Commerce Commission was needed. Okay, I know that's a little bit confusing, but I think if you just remember that the Interstate Commerce Act and the idea that we're trying to figure out ways to help people through government intervention instead of just the government coming on the side of the big businesses. And this was the Interstate Commerce Commission was supposed to be coming in and making some rules so that things were a little more fair. Right. Definition of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This is very important. It's very commonly known and talked about, so I'm pretty sure you'll see this. There were so many of the big businesses, and the idea that the trusts, the businesses, the monopolies had complete control, and that's why it was so hard for everyone else to make money. If somebody has a monopoly or complete control over a business or a sector, it's very difficult for anybody else to come in and compete, which is kind of what they like. So the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was named for legislator John Sherman, someone who worked in Congress, a legislator. And this was an attempt to break up those monopolies and trusts that exploited consumers. So if you have one company and no one can compete against it, the consumers lose because they're paying too much and they don't have any control. Right now, if you don't like something on your telephone service, I think we talked about this before as an analogy. If you don't like your phone service, you go to another phone company and get different service. If I don't like AT&T, I go to Verizon. If I think couldn't get a better deal or being mistreated. If there's only one company, you can only go to one company. Then you're at their mercy. So the idea of the Sherman Antitrust Act is that it was to break up the monopolies and the trusts that exploited consumers. Okay, and here's a very common quote that you'll probably need to remember. Any contract or combination in restraint of trade is illegal. So if you hear anything that says restraint of trade, any contract or combination in restraint of trade, connect that in your mind to Sherman and the Antitrust Act, because the idea was you're restraining trade, it's illegal to do. Okay, the Sherman Antitrust Act did not define restraint of trade very well, and so they took a law and then it was used mostly at first to break up unions. So it was meant to help with the trade and it was used to break up unions. And then in 1895, there was another decision, U.S. versus E.C. Knight Company, K-N-I-G-H-T. And in that court case, the Supreme Court said that manufacturing companies, this was a sugar company at the time, were not monopolies which could be busted. And this was because their manufacturing was done locally and therefore did not restrain interstate commerce. So they didn't write the law very well. So they found ways to get around it. The Supreme Court said, wait a minute, this is a sugar company and it's not really a monopoly because their manufacturing is done locally. So it's not, it doesn't restrain interstate commerce. It doesn't stop commerce in interstate commerce. So it's local. Of course, it's still big and it's still the only one. So but that's how they got around that. So there was a lot of fighting back and forth about trying to break up the monopolies. All right, some of the inventions that you should know that came about during the Gilded Age that were important, because this is all about the time period and what's happening, not just in this sector, but in other things that were going on. So inventions. The incandescent light bulb, very important. We use it all the time. Thomas Edison stayed on longer than earlier light bulbs. That was the incandescent light bulb, Thomas Edison. And I'm just going to give you a few to write down because sometimes on the test they want to throw in some of these questions about who these people were or what contributions they made. And if they don't, then that's fine, but they do. Henry Bessemer, Bessemers, okay, found a way to eliminate impurities in iron so it could be mass produced quicker. So that, of course, helps with the process. In 1869, the golden spike, you will probably hear the golden spike. It completes the railroad. It was hammered in Promontory Summit in Utah. And this completed the Transcontinental Railroad. And railroads were given a lot of land from the federal government. And that was a big boost to the people who owned the railroads. They got a lot of land because the United States government had a real interest, a vested interest in linking the country together. It served the country, too, to be able to transport and travel from east to west. So it encouraged transportation, settlement, trade. So the government wanted a railroad, and it was a bit of a partnership that way. They gave them land, which was a huge boost, of course, to the railroad companies who owned it and got incredibly wealthy. So they were working together on that. So the golden spike is what brought, when you hear the golden spike, think about the railroad being complete, the spike in Utah that joined the two halves so that the interstate, the Transcontinental Railroad was complete at that time. In 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge opened in New York City. It was the largest steel suspension bridge of its time, and it connected Brooklyn to Manhattan. So you can see these are all important ways of getting the country more connected. Either bridges, railroads, however it worked, whichever one of these. The idea is that the country has grown, is more spread out, but we need to have some connection. We need to be able to travel and trade. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone will revolutionize communication in the coming centuries. So that was a good thing to get started. We all appreciate that. To immigration, a little bit more about immigration. It's ongoing and it's constant even today. And I remember some of the things we talked about immigration earlier, where people were coming from, why they were coming. You need to know the difference between a push and a pull in immigration. I don't know that that's even been covered yet, but I'm going to tell you that. A push for immigration, a push is when you leave your country because you are pushed out. There is either war, famine, you're going to be persecuted. There's something that pushes you away. All right, that's one reason that people immigrate, because they're pushed. Pull is the other reason, and that is when you are pulled there because you think something is better. There's something here that is pulling you, either jobs, the economy's better, you know, your family has moved there and now you want to join them. So the idea is that there are two main reasons that people immigrate. It's either they either move because they're getting away from something, so they're being pushed away, or they're going towards something, so they're being pulled in. So think about some of the different reasons that people do immigrate. So two great waves of immigration, they call it, which is just two big times. So the old immigration was 1845 to 1860. That was considered the first great wave of immigration. And most of those immigrants, which I'm sure we've talked about before, were mostly from Western European countries, Ireland, Britain, and the German states. Okay, so those were the earlier immigrants, the Great Wave, 1845 to 1860, mostly Western European countries, Ireland, Britain, and German states. The new immigration was 1890 to 1920, so it's more in the Gilded Age. It goes into the 1900s, 1890, 1920, the second great wave of immigration. And those were mostly from Southern and Eastern European countries, like Italy, Russia, and Poland. Right, so we have the two great waves of immigration, two different people coming from different parts of the world. So the second one was the Italy, Russia, and Poland, the second great wave. There are two theories on immigration. At first, one of them is the melting pot, the idea that there should be total assimilation, basically Americanization of newcomers. In this theory, immigrants lose their culture because they've jumped into a melting pot. They've all been melted and blended into one. So it blends so that we are all U.S. citizens, but we're all blended. We all have the same ideals, as opposed to, you know, coming from different countries and keeping your cultural ideas and your cultural identity, basically. So that's the melting pot, the assimilation idea. Keep those in your head, or keep those together, because that's important. That's the second theory is cultural pluralism, and that's pluralism. And that's the salad bowl idea, they say, as compared to the melting pot. Instead of people melting into one, in this metaphor, immigrants maintain their cultural identity and they coexist with other Americans, but they don't give up their identity. They don't become all the same. So there are two distinct ideas when it comes to immigration. Whether you should, this is the melting pot where you come and everyone becomes the same. We're all Americans and you relate to this culture as America, as what you now have. Or cultural pluralism, which is the idea of the salad bowl as opposed to the melting pot. Immigrants maintain their own identity and they coexist with other Americans. And those are the two ideas. So back then, they wanted people to assimilate. Now it's a little both, I guess. So we'll leave it at that. What was nativism? We talked about nativism. I gave you the definition earlier. How does it affect the immigrants and how many immigrants could come here? Because at one time there wasn't a quota that, you know, people came. We needed workers. We needed people. People came. Now it's a little bigger problem now. And at different times there were limits or quotas put on. So nativism was trying to protect the interests of the native born. So that's where nativism comes from. You're native born here, and now you want to protect those interests, and that becomes a struggle when you're competing with people who come from other countries for jobs, housing, or whatever it is. So nativism is, there's a feeling of opposition towards foreigners based on their nationalistic sentiment. Nativism existed during the Great Wave of immigration. Remember the Know Nothing Party, who they were founded because they were so anti-Irish Catholic. And they later, so that was the first time that you really saw a lot of nativism with the Catholic immigrants. And the Know Nothing Party, which fortunately didn't last very long. Later in the century, nativism led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which limited Chinese immigration. So the idea of nativism carried forth to 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act, which limited Chinese immigration. The Gentleman's Agreement of 1907, I think we talked about this the other day. I went a little ahead the other day because it fit. 1907, Matthew Perry had gone to Japan and finally got them to open up and start to westernize a bit and allow some trade because Japan had said, no, we don't want anything to do with you. Hands off, leave us alone. Matthew Perry went there a couple of times in the 1850s, and he got them to open some communication and trade. So and modernized their economy a little bit. They liked a lot of the ideas of some of the things that had been created in the West, and they used those. Then when people wanted to immigrate here, they faced segregation and discrimination. So after they modernized, they did want to come here. A lot of the Japanese did try to come, but when they came, they faced segregation and discrimination for the same reasons, nativism. In 1917, there was a literacy test. Do you remember we talked about the literacy test for the African Americans or in the South, so for voting? So they were given a literacy test so that they were not allowed to vote because they weren't literate. They didn't know they hadn't ever had a chance to learn to read because they were slaves. So in 1917, a literacy test for immigrants was passed, even though Woodrow Wilson vetoed it. Remember, if Congress can get enough votes on top of that, they can override his veto. So it takes a certain amount of votes to get a bill to the president's desk. He can sign it and it goes into law, or he can veto it, it goes back to Congress, and if they can get more votes, a certain number, then they can override his veto and pass it, even though he doesn't want it to be passed. So they did pass a literacy test for immigrants, even though he vetoed it. It was motivated by xenophobia, and that just means hatred or fear of foreigners. Xenophobia is hatred or fear of foreigners, goes along with the whole nativist idea. That was just before the U.S. entered into World War I. So there was a lot of fear of anybody that was foreign. And that was the literacy test was for immigrants. Now, obviously, most immigrants would not be able to take a literacy test because of the language difference. So it wasn't, the difference is, of course, the slaves had never learned to read. In this case, the immigrants didn't know the language. So either way, you're setting them up for failure, which is pretty much what it was intended to do. The Quota Acts of the 1920s. Specifically the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the National Origins Act of 1924. You can pause me if you want to write those down. Quota Acts of 1920s and the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 specifically, and the National Origin Act of 1924. Those set limits on immigration, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. So this meant that government policy favored the more assimilated or Americanized immigrants. So it was okay to come if you were from Western European countries, such as Britain. Immigration from Eastern Europe was curtailed. It was like, nah, not so much. If you come from Britain or a country that we feel is more like us, then we'll let you come. But if not, we're going to say no now. So the Quota Act was inspired by a belief in a pseudoscience, which means a fake science. It's a made-up science called eugenics. Eugenics, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's really awful. Eugenics attempted to rank the races. So on intelligence and desirability, people were ranked by their ethnicity. So and they called it a science, as though you could really rank people based on how smart they are, judge how smart they are based on their origins. So that's eugenics, and its attempt to rank the races. Southern and Eastern European immigrants were ranked lower than Western European. Of course, they're going to say that if we don't want you here, we're going to have a test, or we're going to rank you, we're going to put the people we don't want lower so that we can say, oh, science says that you're not as good as these people, so we're leaving you out. So it's just a way to back up their racism, their nativism. So that's eugenics. Immigration laws of the mid to late 20th century that you should know. This is obviously all about immigration because it's throughout our history. Immigration Act of 1965. Now, obviously, this is later. But replacing some of these earlier quota acts, this set up a yearly quota of immigration from the Eastern, 170,000 immigrants, and the Western, 120,000 immigrants. So there were yearly quotas. This was updated in 1965, so it did replace that. Eastern was 170,000, Western 120,000 immigrants for those hemispheres. It also made it easier for relatives of immigrants to enter the U.S. So mostly this widened the amount of immigrants coming from areas other than Europe. So most notably, recent immigration has come from places like Latin America and Asia. Much like the older ways of immigration, people come from all over the place for the reasons I told you: pull factors and push factors. Push, jobs and economic opportunity, and push because of war, persecution, either religious or political persecution. So just remember the difference between pull and push, and they're pretty obvious because you're either being pulled or you're pushed, and it does kind of make sense. In the mid-1980s, the government addressed illegal immigration. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. Now we're jumping quite a bit ahead here in terms of, we were at the Gilded Age. This is just because it's all about immigration, and there is a flow to it, and you probably do need to kind of understand how it's progressed. It will help you later when we get there anyway. It's all part of the history you're going to need to know. And the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 targeted employers who hired illegal immigrants. They knew they were illegal. They hired them because they're cheap, and they would they would work for very little money. They didn't have to pay benefits. Ronald Reagan was president at the time, and he was trying to get the businesses to stop hiring so that the illegal immigrants would stop coming. They're coming because they can get jobs. So it was to target the employers so they would stop hiring illegally. It also looked to provide a process for those who lived here already, who were here illegally, to begin living in the country legally, because the problem is when you have people living here illegally, you have no control over anything. You can't keep track of where people are, what they're doing. They also, their lives aren't as good because they have to always live in fear. So that was the Immigration Reform Act of 1986. You can see where immigration started, and that is where, and right now we're fighting about immigration. That obviously, you know that if you follow anything about politics, immigration and how to secure the borders and everything is still a big ongoing drama. So that gets us to the end of the Gilded Age, and there's a little section on just what else is happening in the West at the same time that we will cover next.